halkanii fi guyyaa Oromiyaa.
I'd like to say a few words in Oromo for those Oromos who don't understand English. Please bear with me. Oromonni hundi waamicha keenya fudhatanii baga nagaan dhuftanii isiniin jenna. Qophiin kun kan qophaa'e caayaa bilisummaa Oromoo kan ta'een tokkummaa Oromootaa Ameerikaa bitaa kan jiruuni. Hunduma keessanuu baga nagaan dhuftanii isiniin jenna. Tokkummaan Oromoo Ameerikaa bitaa Oromoota hunda sagantaa bilisummaa Oromoo kan fudhataniif banaadha. Namoonni qabsoo bilisummaa Oromoo deeggaruu barbaadan nutti dabalamuu dandeessu. Fedhii yoo qabaatan kana siyaasa'uu dandeessu. Galgalli kun galgala baay'ee guddaadha naannaa kanatti. Yeroo jalqabaa fi qophii Oromoo qopheessine kana gochuu danda'u keenyaafis dhugaa baay'ee itti gammadna. Kun kan jalqabaati kan dhumaa kan taane abdii qabna. Har'a galgala keessummaa guddaa tokko gidduudhaa qabna. Nama obbo Asmerom Legesse Oromoota gidduu bara baay'ee jiraatee sirna Oromoo sirna Demokiraasii waa'ee gadaa nama yeroo dheeraaf qorateedha. Nu barsiisuuf deema afaan Ingiliziitiin dubbata yeroo qusachuudhaaf jecha afaan Oromootti hiikuu hin dandeenyu har'a. Garuu dubbiin kun viidiyoo irratti waraabamaa jira. Fuula duratti yeroo walga'ii godhannu afaan Oromootiin waan inni jedhe hundumaa akkasitti hiikuu isiniin abdachiisa. Fayyaa taasisu. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Union of Oromos in North America, the San Francisco chapter. Our union is the mass organization of the Oromo Liberation Front. Though the Union of Oromos in North America has been there for the past 16 years, our chapter here in the Bay Area is a fairly new one. Due to our small number, we haven't been able to make ourselves known. But now, with a growing number of Oromos coming to the Bay Area, we have managed to organize this event. Our purpose in organizing such an event is to make the public in the Bay Area aware of who the Oromos are, our rich cultural heritage, and our struggle for basic human rights and freedom. Tonight, we feel very fortunate and honored to have a very distinguished guest among us. Dr. Asmerom Legesse has done an extensive research on Oromo democratic heritage. His work has served as a bridge between the Oromo and the outside world, and has also tremendously contributed to the individual as well as national pride of all Oromos. I'd like to thank Dr. Legesse on behalf of all Oromos for accepting our invitation and coming to the Bay Area, all the way from Philadelphia. Our opening speaker, Mr. Rafiq Bilal, who is an Egyptologist and the co-author of Egyptian Sacred Science in Islam, has been a true friend, a supporter of, and also a supporter of Oromo struggle. He is a well-known community leader and a very distinguished speaker, Mr. Rafiq. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lensa, and good evening to everyone. It is a great honor to be here with you tonight and to say a few words to you from myself, representing myself and other African-American historians and researchers concerning our struggle and its relationship to the Oromo, the struggle of the Oromo people. And I want to be very, very brief because I too am looking forward with great anticipation to listening to Professor Asmerom Legesse. We African Americans are a people who are still seeking our liberation. Although it may appear because of our physical circumstances in this country that we are a free people, we are a very, very confused people who are seeking our liberation because we are seeking to reconnect ourselves with our African values. We consider ourselves, we recognize ourselves to be the Africans who are in the diaspora, who are the furthest branch away from the root of our homeland. We're the furthest branch away from the root, as is illustrated by the fact that our tongue is completely silent. We have lost our African tongue. We have no words left from our particular tribal languages. We also are detribalized. We are Africans who do not know exactly which tribe that we come from. So therefore, in our search to reconnect with Africa, we have been looking for the root of African cultural unity. We find that it's necessary to do this because in this country, the very foundation and the biggest value that we see in America is materialism. Underneath the democracy here, underneath the way of life, is a kind of worship of the dollar bill that is foreign to us as African people. So we are looking and have been looking very hard for cultural unity, African cultural unity. And ourselves, the historians, along with others throughout the world, have found that in ancient Egypt, there are signs, although it is a dead civilization, of the cultural unity of our people. That ancient Egypt is to the African what ancient Greece has been and is to the Western world. So many of us have been studying what we can find from the documents and monuments of ancient Egypt in an attempt to find ourselves as African people. The ancient Egyptians, in speaking of themselves, point to their ancestors as coming from a land called Punt, which is to the south of ancient Egypt. Even Greek historians, such as Herodotus, who came into ancient Egypt in and around 600 BC, before the overthrow of the Egyptian civilization, referred to the land south of Egypt as Punt and as the land of the ancestors of the ancient Egyptians. We see in our studies that the Oromo language is clearly an ancient Cushitic tongue. And we find that within language is preserved the values of a people and the ways and the thoughts of the people in a much more profound way than any group of monuments or depictions or pictures or even writings. It's within the words and the language of the people. So to find the Oromos as the ancestors of the ancient Egyptians with the ancient Cushitic tongue in an area of Africa which is known to be the origin of the human race is a tremendous miracle for us here in this country. Tremendous miracle. It's much more than we had anticipated. In addition to that, to find, along with the living language of Oromo, an alive cultural organization, the Gadaa system, intact, is more than we had ever hoped for. We cannot, as a people, continue to organize ourselves according to individual charismatic leaders. We have to figure a way to organize ourselves along African values and in a profound way that would go beyond individuals. It's just a blessing to us to find that the Gadaa system is intact and is one from which we can learn and which we can use also here. In terms of Ethiopia, I need to say to you that African Americans, by and large, are very, very confused about Ethiopia. When we hear the word Ethiopia, we think of a 3,000-year-old kingdom. We think of the Ethiopia from the Bible. We think of the Ethiopia that Herodotus referred to. We do not yet know that the government of Ethiopia is an outgrowth of one particular ethnic group, the Amhara, and that Menelik is the one who established this most recently in the name, using such an ancient name, but using it fallaciously. When Herodotus spoke of Ethiopia, he was speaking of the ancient Cushitic people. When Herodotus spoke of Ethiopia, he was speaking of Nubians. He was speaking of Canaanites. He was speaking of the Oromo people and other Cushites. This needs to be made known clear. This needs to be clarified in the minds of African Americans and Africans throughout the world, that Ethiopia is not that kingdom, but is another manifestation altogether. In addition to that, African Americans have looked at the image of Haile Selassie as a black hero. We were in isolation during the reign of Haile Selassie, very much in isolation from Africa and the rest of the world, and we believed what we saw in the press. To us, Haile Selassie was a strong black leader. This is what was projected, who was fighting against European colonialism. This is as far as we went. So it's now that the truth about the regime of Haile Selassie and Menelik must come forward to us here in this part of the world and to the rest of the world. So these ideas about Ethiopia need to be dispelled. And this development is beginning to take place. In addition to that, as I say, we look forward with great pleasure and expectation to learning more about the Oromo language and more about the Gadaa system, because these are the values that we have been searching for over the years. And as I say, we feel that we are the furthest branch away from the root of Africa, and we feel that the Oromos are the closest to the root. So that when the root and the furthest branch come together and begin to know each other, then truly the African family is beginning to unite once again. And that is why it's such a pleasure to be here tonight. And without any further words, I would like to introduce to you Professor Asmerom Legesse.
Thank you, Mr. Rafiq. It's wonderful to have an Egyptologist introducing me tonight, because there is in fact a very important connection between the ancient Egyptians, the Berber of North Africa, and the entire Cushitic peoples of the Horn of Africa. There lies the connection, and unfortunately both in Egypt and in Ethiopia there has been a Semitic veneer that has been superimposed on the area, and that is the one that is glamorized. That is to say, Ethiopia will celebrate her Semitic heritage back to Solomon and Sheba and all that, but denigrate essentially her Cushitic heritage. And that's a mistaken view, precisely because it's the African roots, in my view, that are the more important roots. And on that score, I'm completely in agreement. My focus, as you have been told, is Oromo, Oromo culture, Oromo tradition, but mainly Oromo political institutions, especially the Gadaa system. And many Oromo friends have asked me, why is an Eritrean fellow wandering around in southern Ethiopia studying Gadaa? Well, that's a complicated story. Part of the reason for that is that when I was a graduate student at Harvard many years ago, the librarian realized that I was from Ethiopia vaguely, and she said there's a book that was written by an Italian scholar by the name of Enrico Cerulli, who's written a book called The Folk Literature of the Galla, the only book he ever wrote in English, which he published through that institute. And they had many copies of this book in the basement. They didn't quite know what to do with them, so she said, if you want one, we can give you one. So she did give it to me, and I went home and read it from cover to cover with great fascination. A major part of that book was devoted to trying to explain Gadaa. And I thought, my goodness, what an interesting phenomenon this is, and I have to go find it. And so I wrote a dissertation proposal to Harvard and told them this is what I want to study, and they said, great, go do it. And they gave me money to go study Gadaa for 2 years. I arrived in Ethiopia and I didn't know quite where to start. I had 1 year in the university while teaching at the university to find out where to begin to study Gadaa. And what I did basically is I spent all my weekends and vacations taking trips to various parts of Oromo country, starting with Shoa, to Wallanga, to Harar, to Arsi, to Guji, trying to figure out where to do my field work. In all the areas of Oromo country that I had looked at up to that point, including Arsi, I found that the institution was not fully functional, and that in some cases it had basically fallen into decline. In other cases, as in Arsi, they believed they had it, but they weren't quite sure when the next handover was going to take place. And so I thought I should keep going. I kept going, went to Guji, and when I arrived in Guji, they told me, of course we have Gadaa. We have an Abagada, we have a council, full-fledged council, we have Kallus, we have elections, we have the whole works. Where do you want to start? Well, in the course of and I spent quite a bit of time with the Gujis talking about the institution, but in the course of talking to them, I came to realize that they look to Borana, further south, as the place where Gadaa really is. And they also go to Borana to pay tribute to the Warakallo, to give them gifts, to make pledges to them. That ceremony is called Muda. It's a very important ceremony in the history of Borana. Muda, in Mudani, they anoint the Kallu, by which they mean they give gifts. They give gifts to the Kallu. So I decided if the Guji give gifts to the Kallus of Borana, obviously Borana must be the place I should go. So I ended up going to Borana. When I arrived in Borana, I said I want to talk to the Gadaa leaders. They said, and I was in Negeli at that stage, they said they're only 3 miles away from here in a place called Gudo. So I took my Land Rover and we had to slash through the forest to get to Gudo from where I was, about a 5-mile drive. I arrived there and announced that I wanted to study Gadaa, and I was talking to the Abagada. And he said, this is the first time we ever heard of a Sidama who wanted to learn about Gadaa. But that's what you want. We can't talk to you today because this isn't the proper way to talk. Why don't you come back tomorrow and we'll have a meeting. And the following day, he had assembled the entire assembly. Now, in other words, the Boran parliament was in full session, if you will, to sit down and talk to me about Gadaa. There were approximately 22 councillors assembled under a tree, and guess what the tree was? Oda. And so began a period of 2 years of research. My curiosity about this institution was strong enough to keep me going for 2 years, but not just that, for another 10 years beyond that, until the day when I finished writing my book. And in a way, I can assure you that it isn't possible to maintain that level of curiosity about one's own tradition. Being an outsider helps in just keeping you curious about what you're investigating. And so I did a period of 2 years of field research, and one of the amazing things that I experienced while I was working with the Abagada and his council is the degree of openness of communication that existed among them. You try, if you will, to go to Gojam, and you arrive there and you tell them, I'm going to study your political institutions. Let's sit down and talk. Guess what they would do with you? Something like that, right? Indeed, I had a friend by the name of Alan Hoban, an anthropologist who was doing fieldwork at about the same time that I was doing fieldwork, who went to Gojam to study land tenure. And he literally suffered for 6 months because they would come to his house every day with gifts, eggs, chicken, all kinds of stuff, but they wouldn't talk to him. They were just being nice to him, but they would not talk to him about the stuff that he wanted to learn about. Secrecy, in other words, is part of the feudal system. And openness of communication, which the Soviets are just now discovering. They call it glasnost. Openness of communication is the foundation of a democratic political system. So in addition to having political organization, institutions that are democratic, you also have to have attitudes that are democratic. You have to have interpersonal, social relationships that are democratic. You have to have a language that is democratic. One can't just invent the language of democracy. One has to develop it slowly over the years. And so many societies that for the first time adopt democratic institutions find that they don't have a way of talking that is democratic. They don't have interpersonal attitudes that's democratic. They don't even have a way of raising their children that is democratic. Now, you know, those of you in here who are of feudal background like myself will know how children are raised. In Highland Eritrea, in most of Amhara country, in Tigray, how are children raised? Children are there to be seen but not to be heard. They must be quiet in the presence of adults. When the children come home and they meet the father, one of the first things they do is go kiss his feet or his knees. At mealtime, they would sit, the adults would sit around the table and eat, while the children are sitting out there, standing, watching the adults eat, and they eat the leftovers after the adults have eaten. Now, this is not very democratic. Correct? Do you agree with me on this? This is a way of raising children to be maximally humble, to say very little in the presence of adults. Now, you crush the ego of an individual to that extent, and then as adults you expect them to speak, and they can't. They don't have the strength to be able to express themselves. And if they do, when they speak, they feel that every time they speak, it's an act of rebellion. And indeed, it becomes an act of rebellion. Because they don't have a reasonable way of engaging in discord, in disagreement with others, without turning it into a fight. So, I would suggest to you that in addition to institutions, you need a whole system of attitudes, a way of developing, of growing, of socializing children that prepares people for democratic life. And that is what the Oromo have. And that is what has not, in my view, disappeared even after Gadaa was in decline throughout Oromo country, with the exception of the southernmost territories, Guji, Arsi to some extent, and Borana. In other words, I'm suggesting to you that there are many aspects of democratic behavior that are present among Oromo, even in areas where the institution, the formal institution of Gadaa, is no longer there. But I'm not here to talk to you about attitudes and language and all of that. I'm going to talk to you about the institution itself, because that's a very precious institution. And since we found it in one area, fully operational, let me say how the system works. As you know, I published in 1973 a rather fat book, about 350 pages, called Gadaa, and just that. And people have to read the book to find out what Gadaa is. How does the institution work? How is it organized? Let me begin by saying, first of all, by defining Gadaa. In all democratic societies, you need to have a way of sharing power, of dividing up the society and then giving the components of the society some measure of self-government, if you will. In American democracy, territorial divisions are the way people are given autonomy. You have states, you have cities, you have boroughs, you have townships. All of them have a degree of self-government. They have institutions by which they govern themselves. The central government, in other words, the federal government, has a certain degree of power, but it has limited power. Power is shared with all those other components that make up the nation state, if you will. In Oromo, they don't have territorial divisions, they have generation divisions. And this is the peculiar thing about Oromo democracy. That is to say, the whole society is divided up into generation sets. These are generations proper, but they're also subdivisions of generations. There are many such generation sets. In Oromo language, those generation sets are called luba. So you have a whole succession of lubas from the youngest to the oldest. The entire cycle is 88 years long. Each luba has its own internal government, its own leaders called hayu, councillors, who are elected by the members of the luba. They're elected for life. But their authority extends only over their own age group, if you will, or generation set. So you have 11 lubas, each with its own internal government. These lubas go through grades. Now, the grades are very much like, if you will, people going through the school system. They are going through the entire school system, grade by grade. So all these rubas are passing through these grades, and as they go through these grades, when they reach the 6th grade, there's something important that happens. They become the rulers of the entire country for 8 years, but it's a fixed period of 8 years. For 8 years, they govern. They govern the entire territory. At the end of the 8-year period, they hand over power to the next group, and they are out of power. And they are out of power for the rest of their lives. There's no such thing as coming back for seconds, as happens in the American system. And because of that, you have presidents that get elected again and again. And there's a real serious danger of getting presidents for life in American democracy. But you certainly have congressmen for life. There are congressmen that grow old in Congress. They get elected as young men and they stay there until their 80s. Well, that is definitely a weakness in American democracy, and people are going to beginning to grumble about it. That is impossible in the Gadaa system. You're elected along with your entire cohort, the entire, call it age group if you will. You come to power for a limited period of time, you hand over power, and then you're out. You're out, but you maintain advisory responsibilities. You advise the group that are in power, like Carter, if you will, vis-a-vis the present government. Carter is an elder statesman who maintains advisory responsibility of an informal kind toward the government in power. So simply stated, then, Gadaa is simply a way of governing by a succession of groups that come to power one after the other. How do they decide the 8-year period? They have a superb calendar which is devoted just for that purpose. As you know, some of you may have seen the calendars that have been printed in the United States, Oromo calendars, with Oromo names of months. Some of you have seen them. Those Oromo terms are directly the same terms that Borana use. 12 months and 27 names of days. They have no weeks. The system of time reckoning is far too complex for me to be able to explain to you tonight. It took me months and months to try and understand it, but very simply stated, it is this. They look at the moon in relation to the stars. They recognize 7 different constellations lined up vertically like this. The moon rises with the first of these stars this month. Next month it will rise with the second of the stars. The third month it rises with the third of the stars. There's, in other words, a continual shift. At the end of the year, and the year is not the same as our year, it's not 365 days, the first star and the new moon will strike each other again, or daha as they call it, the conjunction of the new moon and the stars. Using this technique, on any day, the Quran experts, who are called ayantu, who are time reckoning experts, can tell you the exact date, what date it is today. They can tell you the month and the day, which is this without writing. It's a superb calendar. There are no such calendars in the world except the Hindu calendar and the Mayan calendar in Central America. And there is no connection between those three. None. These are independent human inventions. So the Quran calendar is an amazing feat, if you will, of the human imagination, and the primary purpose why it was developed was to make sure that somebody is counting the passage of the years so that the politicians don't cheat. So the politicians don't say it's not time yet and keep dragging their feet and extend the period of government. I have recorded the periodicity, if you will, of Gadaa over a very long time. And there is evidence only that the handover of Gadaa happened on only one occasion in living memory, and that was 1935. In 1935, the Borana fought against the Italians. And 1935 was also the year of the handover from one Gadaa to another. And they feared that if they were to meet at one place with all the outgoing leaders and the incoming leaders, the Italians would know exactly where they were or would wipe them out. And so they decided to postpone the handover, and it was postponed by 3 years. And that introduces a degree of confusion into Gadaa, because people reckon both history and their ages using Gadaa as a point of reference, right? Boram, incidentally, know their ages precisely, which is not very common in Africa. Even among literate peoples in northern Ethiopia, people don't know their ages. They do, and the way they do it is very simply by identifying the year, the Gadaa in which they were born. And they will say, I was born in the Gadaa of Jaldes Liban. Jaldes Liban is the Abba Gadaa who was in power when I did my fieldwork, 1960 to 1968. So if somebody tells you I was born in the Gadaa of Jaldes Liban, it means he was born sometime between 1960 and 1968. Then he would say, you ask him, what Gadaa were you born in? Jaldes Liban. How many did you count from that Gadaa is the next question. That is, say, how many years were you alive during that Gadaa? Suppose he says 3 years, it means he was born in 1965, right? And then he would say, all right, between then and now, how many full Gadahs have elapsed? And so he would enumerate them. He would say, Jaldes Liban, Madagalma, Wiyoboru, and so on, right up to the present time. Then he would say, well, what year of the Gadaa are we in now? Suppose we are on the 2nd year. So we have 2 years from here. 4 Gadahs have elapsed in between. 8 times 4 is 32. So 32 and 2, that's 34. He counted 4 years from the other one, 36. He's 36 years old, right? It's a very precise way of reckoning age. It is so precise that I used it in all my surveys. Every individual I talked to, I would get information about them, general information, but I'd also get the precise age of every individual. Children, adults, men, women, everybody can tell you what their age is. Now, that whole technique of counting age was developed as a function of the time reckoning system, of the calendar, which itself was developed in order to make the Gadaa system work. So Gadaa works because there are Ayantu. Ayantu are thought of as diviners in other parts of Ethiopia. They're not diviners in Borana. They do divining, but that's spare time activity. The real business of Ayantu is to count the passage of years. And so the Ayantus come together and decide the 8th year has elapsed. And they know precisely what month and what day within the month the handover must take place. It takes place on the month of Burandala and on the day of Ogoragutta. Okay? So the date is defined. On that day, the outgoing group must be sitting, waiting for the incoming group, the incoming Gadaa, to come and snatch the symbols of authority from their heads. The symbols of authority are ostrich feathers. So the outgoing group sits with their ostrich feathers on their heads. The incoming group comes galloping on horseback and snatches the ostrich feathers away from them, and they are now installed as the new leaders of Borana. Along with that, there's another ceremony which has filtered into Christian Ethiopia, and that is that on the occasion of the passage of authority from one Gadaa to the next, all the fires of the land are put out. Every household puts out its fire. You don't start the new fire with a match. Absolutely not. The new fire is started by a group of young men who come together and light the fire using an ancient method of lighting. They have a shoe which they put on the ground and put bits of wood on it, and then using fire sticks, by rotating fire sticks, they start the fire. That fire is then made into torches, and the young men carrying the torches go from house to house lighting the fires in each home. Those fires must be kept going for another 8 years. That is to say, the fires endure as long as Gadaa endures. When Gadaa ends, all the fires must be put out, and the fires must be relit again. The New Year ceremonies that occur throughout Ethiopia is a derivative from this idea of the passage of Gadaa, which is symbolized by fire. All the the chibo that they carry around at Meskel. That is a Christianized version, if you will, of an ancient Cushitic idea of the passage of time. So I've spent quite a bit of time on the ending of Gadaa because it's a very important democratic idea. If the term of office of a ruler doesn't end, you're in serious trouble. There is a fairly elaborate organization of leaders within each Gadaa. That is to say, a group of councillors are selected. The group of councillors are incidentally selected 21 years before they come to office. They're elected first as leaders of their own Luba, and then later on they become leaders of the entire land. Between those 2 points, 21 years elapse. Now, during that period, these leaders are elected as leaders of their own Luba, but they are under observation by the entire society to see if they make it, to see if they are good enough leaders to qualify as leaders for the whole country. So you're elected, you wait 21 years before you become invested into office as a leader for the whole nation. That's a very distinctive concept of democracy that is peculiar to Oromo. It is, by the way, in sharp contrast with how it's done in the West. In the West, you're elected and you're invested very soon after that. Sometimes you get surprises in the process. And when I described to them elections in the United States, which did happen when I was doing my fieldwork, namely the election of John F. Kennedy, I described them, and they listened to my description with tremendous interest, because so much of it sounded like exactly what they do. Like campaigns, they have campaigns. They go around campaigning and telling people what wonderful people they are. It's exactly what American people have to do in order to be elected to office. But when I finished describing the election of John F. Kennedy, and I told them he's now invested, he's now president of the United States, they said, how can they do that? How can they go around telling people what wonderful people they are, be elected by the people, and then a month or two later be invested into office? What, they said, if he turns out to be a fool? And, of course, a perfectly reasonable question. You have fools, you have criminals, you have all kinds of characters who get elected into office, and people don't have anything they can do about it. Indeed, I know of one Mayor Curley of Boston who was elected to the office of the mayor from jail. He's an offender, an apprehended offender who got elected into office because people liked him. So in any case, what they're doing is designing the system in such a way that people have ample opportunity to see the person who is going to govern their land in an office similar to the top office. It's not good enough to have him serving in some other capacity. It has to be in an office similar. So each Luba is, in a sense, a replication of every other Luba. So they are serving as leaders of their own Luba for 3 Gadaa grades before they become invested as leader of Borana as a whole. So this is another aspect of Boran democracy, or Oromo democracy, which is interesting because, in a sense, they have devised ways of conducting democratic government that are uniquely theirs, and in some respects they are ahead of other democracies. In other respects they are not. Let me mention just 1 or 2 senses in which they are not ahead of other democracies. Women are out. They're not part of the system. Gadaa in its entirety is a male organization. And the women have all kinds of peripheral things that they do along with all this, but they're not part of it. So, modern Oromo political organization will have to do something about that. The other thing is really a technical problem, namely election. How do you count votes? Counting votes is a mechanical process. It's a process that requires technology. It requires pollsters are scientists in this country. They can't do polls. And what they've done to conduct the election process is, first of all, as I mentioned earlier on, people go around making wonderful speeches about themselves, and everybody listens very attentively and goes on and makes up his mind independently. The way they do it, though, is they have a council of electors. And you recall the office of Kallu, which exists throughout Oromo country, but it has been altered in meaning, and it means something else in other parts of Oromo. In Borana, it means elector. The Kallu is the elector. His man, his descent group, his family, his extended family, called Warra Kallu, are the council of electors. They decide who is the most popular candidate. People have to come to them, both those who want competing candidates arrive at the Kallu's village, each trying to say, our side is the better side. Others arrive in the village, trying to say, one side or the other is the better of the two. Out of all this, the Warra Kallu decide which one is the better one. But it's an informal process, and it's subject to corruption. And there is corruption in Borana. And the corruption takes place in the forms of gift giving on a grand scale that goes on during the time of elections. People come with horses and livestock and money and all kinds of stuff, which is given to the Warra Kallu, and it's not regarded as an offense. I mean, that's what's done. It's like campaign funds, I mean, it's sort of murky, you don't quite know what is bribes, what is legitimate campaign contributions, and so on. It's part of the same sort of a process. And so the Warra Kallu in any case decide, and they have to decide it in an informal fashion. There is no mechanical way of counting votes. And so as Gadaa is instituted as a modern political system, which I hope it will be someday, clearly adopting modern ways of counting votes would be a perfectly legitimate innovation to introduce, borrowed from other more modern democracies. I can't think of too many other weaknesses in the Gadaa system. I think it is quite a remarkable political organization. Now, Israel was helpful enough to mimeograph 2 pages of my paper, which sums up the list of principles underlying the Gadaa system. What I'm doing on those 2 pages is attempting to abstract the fundamental ideas underlying Gadaa, so that whether one is Oromo or not, it would be possible for people to look at these principles and say, is it possible to incorporate these principles into a modern democratic socio-political system? Let me go through those principles. Some of them I've mentioned already in describing the cycle. Others I have not. And my own thinking about Gadaa is evolving day by day. I'm in the process of writing a book which will be a sequel to this one, which will be called Oromo Democracy, and it will be published jointly with Dr. Muhammad Hassan, who is an Oromo historian. And essentially what we are doing with that is attempting to describe Gadaa in less technical language than I have done in this book, so that it's more readily accessible to more people, and also attempting to say, what is Gadaa like outside of Borana, in other parts of Oromo country? Even if we weren't able to see it in full operation, there is now enough information about it for us to be able to say variations in the structure of the institution across the whole of Oromo country was thus. But beyond that, to try and abstract the basic principles that seem to be common to all Oromo, so that in organizing the new institution, if it becomes the new basis of government, then the principles could be accessible. And then thirdly, what Muhammad Hassan and I are now trying to do is to look at Ethiopian history to see what happened to Gadaa during the process of Menelik's colonial conquest. Menelik conquered southern Ethiopia, and in the process of doing that, he sometimes deliberately destroyed Gadaa. In the case of Borana, I have fairly good records of what he did, and I'll tell you what he did. Ras Haptegiorgis, Fitaurari Haptegiorgis, was the one who conquered Borana, and they came, of course, heavily armed with firearms. Borana did not have firearms. Borana are very wise people. They said, no point fighting. They put up very little resistance. Menelik's armies got in, and one of the first questions that Menelik asked was, who's their chief? Now you go to a democratic society as complex as this one and try to figure out the chief when you're in serious trouble. Who's their chief? Bring me their chief to Addis Ababa so I can appoint him ruler of his own land, to govern on my behalf, in my name. They said, well, the closest approximation that we can come to by way of chiefdom is Kallu. So they take Kallu, Kuyo, Anna to Anna, I'm sorry, his father, to Anna. Anna goes to Addis Ababa, a 1 month trip on muleback, on horseback, arrives in the palace of Emperor Menelik, and Menelik tells him, I'm now going to appoint you ruler of your land, and you shall be appointed Fitaurari. And the Kallu says to Menelik, Your Majesty, or whatever language he used, that's not possible. You can't appoint me, Fitaurari, without appointing my opposite number, the other Kallu, Fitaurari. There are two Kallus. And the power of the two Kallus is balanced. You throw the whole system out of kilter if you appoint one Kallu, Fitaurari, and not the other. And Menelik says, why would anybody want to have his adversary appointed to the same office as himself? Doesn't make sense. The Kallu says, that's the way we do it. And so Menelik sends off for the other Kallu. They wait 1 month in the palace for the other Kallu to arrive, 2 months. The Kallu arrives and they're both appointed Fitaurari, one of the Sabbo moiety, the Sabbo half of Boran society, the other of the Gona half of Boran society. So in addition to the Abagada, who's head of all Borana, there are 2 electors for 2 halves of the society, and their power is balanced. But that's the only aspect of Boran political organization that Menelik bothers with. Gadaa he didn't bother with, because Gadaa is complicated, because Gadaa is democratic, and you can't fit a democratic system onto a monarchy, onto a feudal system. The two don't mesh in. One of the reasons they don't mesh in is because you can build loyalty among a hereditary group. And the Kallu's authority is hereditary. It passes on from father to son. The Abagada, on the other hand, is there for 8 years. What do you do the next time around? You have to start that whole process all over again, trying to win the loyalty of the next Abagada. This is confusion. This is bad theme. So essentially, Menelik attempted to suppress Gadaa and to build up Kallu into a feudal or a quasi-feudal organization. And that's essentially what Menelik did everywhere. Wherever he went in Oromo country, he built up some hereditary group to a position of enduring power, allied to him directly, while suppressing elective offices that come and go, because they are unstable. They cannot work within a democratic system. So what Mohammed and I are going to try to do is study that process and try to understand how Gadaa came to be marginalized in this process. Now, I say marginalized because that's not the only thing that happened to it. It went underground. And institutions that go underground doesn't mean they're dead. It just means they're hidden from view. When I went to Arsi, you know, Arsi is one of the most cruelly treated segments of Oromo country in Ethiopia, because the Arsi fought a resistance war against Menelik that lasted for 9 months. And at the end of that period, Menelik went in with all his might and destroyed the Arsi nation. Arsi leadership, Gadaa, Kallu, everything was wiped out, and in place of that, he planted his own Naftanya class of rulers. What did I find when I went to Arsi? Gadaa was there, but it was decidedly not a public institution. It was a hidden institution. And I had to work for months to try and figure out what there was of Gadaa operating still among the Arsi. Likewise in Borana. In Borana, the Abagada was there, and people paid tremendous respect to him and viewed him as higher in authority than the Gallu. Because after all, there are two Gallus. There's only one Abagada for all Borana. So in people's views, the leader of Borana was really the Abagada, whereas the two Gallus were electors, and that was the only function that they had. And so, nevertheless, the Abagada and his entire organization was unknown to the local Sidamas, like myself, which is partly why they were so surprised to hear me talking my head off about Gadaa, because most of the Amhara, Tigrayans, northern Ethiopians who lived in Borana didn't have the vaguest idea about the Gadaa system, didn't care about it really, but didn't understand it, and certainly didn't think of it as a system of government, although it is a full-fledged system of government. Surprisingly, a lot of the researchers who went to Oromo country come away with the same impression. Paul Baxter says Gadaa is not a system of government, it's a ritual system. Because as an underground system, of course, it looks like a bunch of rituals, but it doesn't look like a political institution. So in any case, going back to the project that we are undertaking with Muhammad Hassan and other Oromo scholars, is to try and write the history of Gadaa under Ethiopian colonial rule, how much of it was destroyed, how much of it went underground, how much of it continued to exist in the form of people's values, attitudes, language, behavior, and so on and so on. And my hope is that in the course of our discussions today, you will have gotten enough of enough leads for you to want to pursue this matter further. How does the language of democracy function in Oromo meetings, in villages? Let's not talk about formal political institutions. Let's talk about any Oromo village meeting. Within those meetings, there is the language of democratic discourse which we need to write about, which we need to expose. I have been talking to friends right here in San Francisco today, and we've come up with a few words which I want to share with you. And they're all part of democratic discourse. I'll first of all mention a few that are used in Borana. In a meeting is called Kora. And the word Kora actually occurs elsewhere too. Kore, I just discovered, is used as a word for committee. It's directly derived from the older word Kora for meeting. If an individual misbehaves in a meeting, Boran say Jilibeka, which means recognize ritual, recognize the laws, behave yourself. Dubinaken, give me the opportunity, the chance to speak. Children will say that in a meeting. If a child walks into an adult meeting and he wants to be heard, he'll say Dubinaken. And they'll say, all right, you've got it, speak. And they do. They speak their piece. Now, from other parts of Oromo, I was told today to speak in order, step by step. It's called Awatan Hasai. Speak, don't just ramble off. Speak in orderly progression. Margan Kabi, give me a chance. Stop, let me talk, and so on. There's a whole vocabulary, in other words, that is part of the language of democratic discourse, and we need to record that. We need to preserve it. Okay, to wind up, let me just go through the principles of Oromo democracy, which I have listed on the mimeograph sheets that you got, and add a couple of other principles to them. First principle, periodic succession. Government for limited periods of time. Oh, the papers have not been circulated?
No.
Why did
no.
people got them?
No, no.
Ah, Okay, well, just pass them around. Okay. I'll begin to talk as we do that. So, first principle, periodic succession, that government lasts for a limited period of time, and it is 8 years in every part of Oromo country. I have not found a single exception to that. Everywhere you go, the period of government is 8 years and it's fixed. Also, the period of a generation is 40 years, and that too is fixed. 40 years. A generation is 40 years, and a period of government is 8 years, which means in the Boran system of thought, 5 generations succeed each other, one after the other, until the next cycle begins. The second principle, which is not on your chart, but I've added that in my more recent thinking, is the rule against entrenchment. That is to say, there is an absolute constitutional prohibition against holding the same elected office more than once. You cannot succeed yourself, in other words. The third principle, that is on your chart, is the principle of balanced opposition. That is to say, the whole system is a system of checks and balances. By that I mean, it's not the 3 branches of government. Americans think immediately of the 3 branches of government when they talk about checks and balances. All kinds of ways of organizing checks and balances. In the case of Oromo, checks and balances occur in many forms. I'll mention just a few. Generations are balanced against each other. The father's generation and the son's generation are not in the same side. They're on opposite camps. The grandfather's generation and grandsons are on the same side. Now, a friend from Wallaga this morning just told me, is he here? Just told me that there are words to describe alternate generations. Do you remember them? What are the terms from Wallaga?
Hobo and Choro.
Huh?
Hobo and Choro. Hobo and Choro.
Choro. Hobo and Choro. If a father is hobo, his son is Choro. His grandson is hobo. Right? So, grandfather and grandson are allies, and they're opposed to the middle generation. Now, why do that, do you think? Why do that? It's because fathers are jealous of their authority and tend to continue their authority beyond normal limits. One way of limiting that is to say, all right, the 2 weak generations, grandparents and grandchildren, will come together and stand in opposition to the middle generation. Now, there are parts of Africa where this has been transformed into a physical arrangement of the village. That is to say, the grandparents build their huts on one hemicycle, the sons opposite hemicycle, the grandsons on an inner hemicycle on the same side as grandparents. A line drawn between the two. Joking behavior between them. If the father becomes too disciplinarian, the grandchild can run off to the grandfather and get the protection of the grandfather. So what they've done is, they've taken an inherently hierarchical, unequal situation and transformed it into a relationship of balanced opposition. Right? You can take any linear arrangement that you wish, any hierarchy, and if you allow alternate groups to be allied to each other, you transform that linear hierarchy into a dual opposition. Are you with me? Take the college years. Freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors. We know that everybody persecutes freshmen. In Borana, that happens too. The most junior kids tend to be persecuted by the ones immediately above them. But what they say is that the freshmen and the juniors are allies. The sophomores and seniors are allies. And the two stand in opposition to each other. So what is a straightforward linear arrangement is transformed into a dual organization of two balanced groups. Checks and balances. This is one way of creating checks and balances in systems that lack that system of checks and balances because it is hierarchical. It's linear in organization. One principle of checks and balances. Another principle of checks and balances is the dual organization that I mentioned earlier on, the two Kallus. The two Kallus, by the way, are the heads of two big moieties. All of Borana is divided into two equal halves. One half is called Sabbo, the other half is called Kona. Above that, the Boran as a whole stand in opposition to another group called Gabra. Boran and Gabra are two halves that stand in opposition to each other. Way back in the 17th century, Oromo nation as a whole was divided into two halves called Borana and Baretuma. Borana and Baretuma were two equal halves that governed, by the way, and Europeans who go and see the system declare immediately the Boran, who are the senior ones, are the aristocrats, and the Gabra are the commoners. Complete nonsense. Because Boran and Gabra, Borana and Baretuma in ancient times governed alternatively. That is, say, if you look at the Abagadas who got elected in succession, there'll be sometimes Boran, sometimes Gabra, sometimes Boran, sometimes Baretuma. And in the course of history, there will be as many Boran as Baretuma who have governed. So there's no way that you can interpret that as aristocrats and commoners. It's a dual division that allows balancing of power between two groups. So the two Karlus I mentioned earlier on, you remember the two who were taken to Menelik's palace to be given the title of Fitaurari? Those two Karlus are the electors of the two moieties, and they are balanced against each other. Yet another balancing is between Warrakallu on the one hand, the two Karlus, and Warrar Bora, who are the Abagadas. The Abagada and his entire organization is one half of the society. The Warrakallu, the electors, are the other half of the society. They too stand in opposition to each other. I cannot, in the course of just this evening, exhaust the many ways, the many systems of checks and balances that they've introduced into the system. What's the purpose of all this? The purpose is to make it extremely difficult for any individual, any group, any class to usurp power, to gain more power than is their due. And yet, that is what happened in the late 19th century. We know, in Wallaka, the Bakare family, the Jote, Morota, Gobana in Shawa. All these are military figures who became entrenched in power, who usurped power, and who allied themselves ultimately with Emperor Menelik and became part of the Ethiopian feudal system. How did that come about? It came about because there is, let me mention one more weakness of the Gadaa system. Because warriors are a problem in the Gadaa system. Warriors. The warrior who goes out there and fights and distinguishes himself in the battlefield has a tendency to come back a hero, and heroes are a problem for democracy, because they tend to become more powerful than is desirable. The ancient Romans ran up against that problem, and what they did was, as the warrior, the distinguished hero, comes back to the gates of Rome, he was cleansed at the gate of Rome. He had to perform a little ritual that cleans him of all this bloodshed that has become part of him. And one of them, Cincinnatus, was actually celebrated and sent off to his farmland away from Rome, so as not to interfere with the political organization of Rome. The Oromo have dealt exactly with that problem, and what they've done is to try to demilitarize the political leadership of the Oromo. That is to say, both the Warrakallu don't carry arms at all. Kallu cannot kill anything, cannot bear arms. That's one way of doing it. The other way is to say that the Gadaa leaders are really in warfare purely symbolic leaders. Somebody else has to be the Abba Dula, the war chief. And the war chief is then therefore separated from political leadership. But we know that there are some Abagadas like Mada in Borana, Mada Galma, who became a very distinguished warrior, but was also an Abagada, and he was tending to overpower the system, so people were forever talking about Mada as a problem. And what happened in the late 19th century is that war became a continuous phenomenon. The war chiefs historically went on a single campaign, came back, and they became ordinary citizens. In the late 19th century, the wars went on and on and on for decades. In the meantime, the war chiefs became entrenched in positions of political authority and ultimately allied themselves with the Ethiopian feudal system. And that, in very simple language is one of the ways in which Gadaa collapsed, if you will, in other parts of Oromo country. All right. I mentioned 3 principles so far: periodic succession, rule against entrenchment, balanced opposition. Conversion of hierarchy into balanced opposition, I mentioned that earlier on, the alliance of alternate groups. The pre-election of successors. What do you do if the leaders that you've elected turn out to be unable to govern, or they're killed in war? Very often that happens for the elected leaders. They're actually killed in war. What do you do? There's a whole group of councillors who are elected at the same time as the senior councillors, and they have no function except to serve as a shadow council, like the shadow government of the British political system. They're just waiting to take over, in case something happens to those who've been elected. Now, one very important aspect of one very important principle of Gadaa is the accountability of leaders to their people. That is to say, if it turns out that they are not proper leaders, not just, not fair, or violate the laws, which is even worse, then they can be removed from office while in office. And the way that is done is most interesting. It is done in a great meeting called Gumi Gayo. Gumi Gayo. Gayo is simply a place name. Gumi is the key word. Gumi means many, multitude. It's the meeting of the multitude. It's not the meeting of a council, it's not the meeting of a Luba, it's not the meeting of a moiety, it's not the meeting of any one group, it's the meeting of all Borana in one great assembly. It's the assembly of assemblies. That has happened several times, and it's been recorded once by a research assistant of mine by the name of Tari Jarso, and more very recently by a teacher in Marsabit, Abdullah Shongolo, who went to Ethiopia and observed the entire assembly. So we have fairly good record of what happens in this grand meeting to which any Borana can come, along with all the leaders. All the councillors of all the Lubas who are living, they all turn up at this meeting. It's one great big conference. Boran say that is the authority, the ultimate authority in Borana. It's not the Avagada, it's not the Kallu, it's not anybody but the assembled multitude. We the people, if you will, Boran style. The Luba that is in power, in the middle of its term, appears before this council. And the council goes through the record of their activities and decides whether they are proper leaders or not. If they are not proper leaders, if they are deemed inadequate or considered to have violated the laws, then they are removed from office on the spot. The removal of an individual from office is called bukisu, which means to uproot, the uprooting of an officer. And this is not a dead letter. It is something that has been done in living memory on 4 different occasions. They could tell me of 4 instances when the leaders were found wanting and were removed from office. I think that's probably one of the most important principles that the Oromo have incorporated into their system. The final one that I'd like to mention is the principle of power sharing, which I described very briefly with regard to Luba. Each generation set is a self-governing entity, and power is therefore shared between the ruling group and all the other Lubas in the land. There are many other principles along which the nation is divided into moieties, the left and right moieties, into clans within that, into lineages within that, each and right down to the village. All of them have their internal government and their authority. And so it's power sharing, not just within the Gadaa system, but throughout the system. That is the fundamental principle. Okay, I think I would like to stop talking here. I can talk, as you might have noticed, indefinitely about this system. But let me stop here and let you ask questions and share ideas, share thoughts about your own recollections, perhaps, concerning Gadaa in other parts of Oromo country. Thank you.
Before we close the evening, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for coming and attending this special event. I would also like to thank Dr. Asmerom Legesse for being here, and especially I'd like to thank him on behalf of all Oromos for the wonderful work you've been doing and for your continued interest and curiosity in Gadaa and for all your contribution. And the Oromos in San Francisco have a present for you that I would like to present. To be honest, this is very emotional for me. His contribution cannot be expressed in few words. It has contributed to our ongoing struggle, to our identity, it's our pride, and I would really like to thank you on behalf of all Oromos and present this to you. And he says to Professor Asmerom Legesse, thanks for your tremendous contribution. The Oromo nation owes you a great debt.
I am delighted that the Oromo struggle has reached the point that it has reached and has liberated territory. The Battle of Asosa is obviously a major turning point in the history of the struggle in the country. Nothing more than the fact that the Eritreans and Oromos are allies in this war. Our purpose is really to write it in such a way that it becomes available to very many people, that it will be published very cheaply so that people can get access to it. And I can mention, I guess, here, I should really have talked to Mohammed Hassan about this before I make this announcement, but I'd like to announce that, as I said in my previous talk in Toronto, all the revenue from the first publication of Gadaa, I have contributed to the Oromo Studies Association. The starting point for establishing the Oromo National Archive that would simply collect information that's available on Oromo history and make it available to Oromo scholars who can do research on this. And I'd like on this occasion to say that as soon as Gadaa Democracy is published, the revenues of that will be used for the purpose of furthering the same.
Akas Unika Sadi Oromia bilisam suf kutate Aba ondar tarte kutate Oromia bilisam suf kutate Irenya si adunya da fipsite Jeloti Oromo amate Akas Abu Litire ويسمى ليلي نانو ويلي ويسمى ليلي